Hello and welcome to the Pilgrim Way. My name is Norman Graham and I'm a minister in the Baptist Union of Churches in Scotland. The aim of these signposts is to try and help to connect the text of the Bible with our everyday lives. Welcome to our series on the Sermon on the Mount, and I want to continue that by reading from Matthew chapter 5 verses 38 to 42. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Well, it's a common saying in many Western cultures that religion generally, perhaps Christianity in particular, is nothing more than a crutch for people who can't handle the difficulties of real life. Yet according to what we have already explored in the Sermon on the Mount, nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, I would say that based on the Sermon on the Mount alone, it is more difficult to live according to the teachings of Jesus than not to. Even these few verses that we've read today offer a radically different vision of how to live in the world, and one that is much more difficult than that experienced or pursued by most people. Later in this sermon, Jesus reminds us that the way of life is narrow and only a few find it. In contrast, the path to destruction is easy, wide and well trodden. In verse 38, Jesus quotes directly from Exodus 21 and verse 24. This is known as the lex talionis, or the law of retaliation. But it's not unique to the Bible. It was in fact a principle widely known in various forms throughout the ancient world. The first written record we have of it is in the Code of Hammurabi from around 1750 BC. Although in that code the scale of retribution was dependent upon your social status. A distinctive feature of this law in Exodus is that it applies to the rich and powerful as equally as it applies to the poor and vulnerable, and is one of a list that includes hand for hand, foot for foot, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. It might seem barbaric to us, but in ancient times it was actually a great step forward in social justice because, as Leon Morris notes, it meant even-handed justice without respect of persons. No matter how great the offender, he couldn't escape just punishment. And no matter how small, no more could be exacted of him than his offence merited. Simply put, the law requires that the punishment should exactly match the crime, and it had two basic principles. Firstly, it helped to prevent further crime. Deuteronomy 19 and 20 basically says that when people see that the punishment fits the crime and that it cannot be avoided, no matter how rich or connected you are, it will act as a deterrent from further crimes. I think that current events perhaps highlight the need for our government today to take this approach more seriously. It seems increasingly that the rich and the powerful and the well-connected can get away with just about anything, whilst the poor and the vulnerable are denied justice and dignity and are pushed further and further into poverty. So this was a huge step forward in ancient law, and it could be a step that we should take today. Secondly, the lex talionis prevented excessive and unjust punishment. The law prevented people from exacting personal revenge in the way that Lamech did, for example, in Genesis 4, where he says, I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. The punishment was to match but not to exceed the crime itself. So we can see that this principle of lex talionis was a just principle because the punishment matched the crime. It was a merciful principle because it limited our very human propensity to seek vengeance. And it was a beneficial principle because it placed restraints on wrongdoing for the whole of society. Considering that, you would expect Jesus to defend and support the principle, especially as in this section of the sermon he's seeking to show the ongoing validity of the First Testament law. Yet he appears to set it aside and commands a new ethic of behaviour that's radical and surprising. Here, as elsewhere, Jesus presupposes that a new situation has arisen with the dawning of the reign of God on earth, and he repeatedly calls his followers to live in light of that new situation. In addition, the principle for an eye was supposed to be administered by the civil authorities and courts. It was not supposed to be administered by individuals to deal with personal disagreements. But like oaths in the previous section of the Sermon on the Mount, by the 1st century, the practice had become corrupt. It had become a license for exacting personal revenge. Jesus speaks into that situation of personal revenge and offers a new approach for individuals to take. In no way do his commands abolish the role of the state in creating and enforcing laws to punish wrongdoing. It is not civil justice that he is opposed to, but personal selfishness. Jesus' approach is as shocking to the modern reader as it was to his audience on the mountainside. He says that we have not to retaliate or to try and enact retribution for any wrong that has been done to us. Historically, Baptist Christians, especially those closest to the Anabaptist tradition, have understood these texts in a very radical way, often citing texts like this as an endorsement of pacifism. But I'm not sure that this text on its own is actually calling us to renounce violence, though perhaps there are other scripture texts alongside this one that would suggest that is ultimately the correct approach for followers of Jesus to take. It's important to note, though, that the context here is on personal relationships and not on public order or international relations. This is not a call to let terrorists or tyrants do what they want. Jesus is simply instructing his followers not to be intent on getting their own back when someone wrongs them. And to illustrate this point, Jesus gives 4 examples from everyday life. Firstly, he speaks about a slap on the cheek. Now, we will understand this illustration better if we realise that a slap on the right cheek would have been a backhanded slap with the right hand. In ancient times, no one would have used their left hand because, in the absence of andrex, it was used for other things. The offence of a backhanded slap on the right cheek was not so much the violence itself, but rather that, according to the social customs of the ancient Near East, it was an insult to a person's honour. Not even a slave would have been dealt with in such a way. To offer your cheek to someone in such circumstances was totally unthinkable and countercultural. Secondly, Jesus speaks about the shirt off your back. Well, the tunic was a kind of undershirt worn next to the skin, and the cloak was an outer robe. If you were so poor that you were literally being sued for the shirt off your back because of a debt, you were really in trouble. However, the person suing you could not sue you for your outer robe because it was forbidden to do so in Exodus 22 verses 26 and 27, Deuteronomy 24 verses 12 to 13, and in Amos 2 verse 8. If you took a man's outer robe in pledge for a loan, you had to return it every night before sunset because the poor used their robe as a blanket to sleep in at night. Jesus says that if you're being sued for the shirt off your back, you should also give your outer robe, which was an indispensable piece of clothing. Jesus' suggestion, therefore, is beyond shocking to his audience. As Glenn Stassen notes, he's basically saying, take off your coat and your shirt and give them both to the greedy person while standing naked in the law court. In Jesus' culture, that would be enormously embarrassing. It would reveal the plaintiff's greed in all its nakedness. The idea being that the plaintiff would be shamed into withdrawing their lawsuit against you. Thirdly, he speaks about forced labour. During the Roman Empire, a soldier could force any non-Roman citizen of a conquered country to carry his pack for about a mile. In fact, he could even organise conscripted work crews to help build roads and fortifications, etc. A good example of this in the New Testament is when Simon of Cyrene is forced to carry Jesus' cross. Obviously, people forced to carry out such tasks were not too happy about it. Every time a Jew was conscripted by Roman soldiers to do something like this, it was another reminder that they were a conquered people and a powerless people. And so the level of resentment against this practice was very high in Jesus' society. So Jesus is advocating an outrageously generous approach. Don't just walk 1 mile, offer to walk 2. And lastly, he speaks about the beggar's bowl. And Jesus is turning the tables here. Instead of disciples confronting an oppressor, he envisages disciples being confronted, but this time not by an oppressor, but by a poor beggar. Jesus teaches that his disciples have not only to respond with positive treatment to those who ill-treat them, but they should also give to those who beg and borrow. The words give and asks are unqualified, and so there's no determination given or sought as to whether the person deserves the help that they seek or what it will cost you to give it. Jesus is looking for his followers to demonstrate outrageous generosity. We have to help and not refuse by turning away. To refuse to help someone because they got themselves into this mess is actually hypocritical, because the truth of the matter is, we all know it from our own experience, is that we all get ourselves into a mess from time to time. And to refuse to help someone for whatever reason is therefore to fail to be a disciple or follower of Jesus. So what is Jesus commanding here? Is he saying that we should never resist evil, or that we should renounce all our legal rights? It seems that Jesus has in mind the context of revengeful retaliation, and it's in that context that we can best make sense of these commands. I don't think that Jesus is commanding that we should never resist evil, for he himself repeatedly resisted the evil of the temple authorities, the scribes, the Pharisees, those who were greedy, and of course he resisted the evil of Satan. Although it must be said that in each case the evil that he resisted was in a sense not directed at him personally, but against others, especially God the Father. So the emphasis here seems to be twofold. Firstly, Jesus seems concerned about our motives for resistance and retaliation. Glenn Stassen suggests that the word translated here as resist normally means to not engage in revengeful or violent retaliation. The fact is that when we retaliate, it's usually fundamentally about asserting our own rights over another individual or over a situation. When we retaliate, we are declaring that we did not deserve to be treated in a particular way, that it's a violation of our rights and we now feel compelled to address. Jesus expects his followers to behave differently. As Bonhoeffer says of this text, followers of Jesus who experience injustice do not cling to their own rights as if they were possessions to be defended at all costs. Instead, they are completely free of such possessions and are bound to Jesus Christ alone. Secondly, I think that Jesus is concerned about the evil of retaliation. Evil cannot be defeated by evil means. Again, it was Bonhoeffer who faced an evil on a daily basis during the Nazi era in Germany, who said that the goal of evil is to reproduce, to increase by eliciting an evil response from the person who has been wronged. But the evil becomes powerless when it is not opposed, but is willingly borne and suffered. The success of the non-violent, non-retaliatory resistance of the civil rights movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is testimony to the truth of those words. Even though people were beaten and abused in every way, some were even killed, they never struck back. They never retaliated with the same hate or violence, and their peaceful bearing of cruelty shamed their oppressors and made the evil of their oppression so obvious that eventually the nation could no longer bear to participate in it. That's an aspect of it that comes across very powerfully in the movie Selma, and the President of America is embarrassed by what he's seeing on the TV screens. People being beaten by the police and not retaliating, not striking back, but just bearing it. It shamed the nation into changing the law. The Apostle Paul says in Romans 12, "Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Do not take revenge. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." Note the point that we have to overcome evil. So I don't think that Jesus is saying that at all that we should never resist the evil done by evil people. But why and how we resist is of the utmost importance. It seems clear that for Jesus, violence is never an option. Resistance on the basis of asserting our rights over another person is never an option. The civil rights movement resisted the evil of segregation, but they saw equality for all, not the dominance of their rights over someone else's. As always, our ultimate example in all of this is Jesus himself, of whom we are told when they hurled insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. In the same way, when he was on the cross and the thief shouted abuse at him and he remained silent, even having been nailed to the cross, beaten, spat on, mocked and reviled, his response was, "Father, forgive them." If we would be his followers, that kind of has to be our response too. We too must trust ourselves to him who judges justly. See, the truth is that no one gets away with anything. "Vengeance is mine, I will repay," says the Lord. We don't have to take revenge and retaliate, because actually no one gets away with anything. And so Christianity, true Christianity, being a follower of Jesus, patterning your life on his, obeying his commands, it's no crutch for someone who can't cope with the harsh realities of life. Not at all. Quite the opposite. And perhaps that is why it's a narrow way. But the narrow way, we're told, is also the path to life. I pray that you will be walking that path today. Thanks for listening.